Well, I think we'll start and let people join. So welcome, I'm Ella, pleased to see you all here. We are going to spend about an hour and a half together and we're going to reflect on the findings of the SRA's report in conjunction with the Young Foundation that was done earlier this year. And we're going to look at the findings from a social class perspective. So hopefully you're in the right place and that is what you thought you were signing up to, because that is what we're here to discuss. And we have five great panelists. So we have Lee, who is a trustee of the SRA. We have Jackie Carter and Steve Lacey. We have Sinead Hassan and Jan Shuri. So it looks to be a great hour and a half together. So I really want this to be a collaborative session as much as possible. We can't see or hear you if you're watching us, but do feel free to use the chat function. It would be great to kind of hear your reactions to the conversations that are going on. We also have a Q&A button where you can pose questions, so do make use of that as well. I'll bring in questions throughout. The only one caveat to that is that Steve has to leave us a bit earlier, so we might skip over questions after Lee's presentation and then carry on through, but otherwise we'll keep coming back to questions throughout. So we will start in a moment, but before we start, I just wanted to tell you a quick story about Marmite. So I was at a family party this summer, late August, and my family is humongous, massive. So my mum's one of 8, so I have a lot of cousins, a lot of uncles and a lot of aunties, and we all went to Somerset, where my auntie lives, to celebrate her 70th birthday party. Because I have a huge family and they're all quite crazy, that meant sort of basically a 3-day festival in her garden. So I'll set the scene for you. There's tents everywhere and people staying up all night, and it's all a bit mad. Anyway, while I was at the party, I was in the kitchen, and my younger cousin came into the kitchen and she was making some toast, as you do, about midnight during this party. And she went into the cupboard because she was looking for a spread to use on her toast, and she pulled out a bottle of Marmite. I tried to get a bottle as small as the one she pulled out. This was the smallest I can get, but if you can imagine, it was about half this size, so tiny bottle of Marmite, and we were laughing. She's like, it's the smallest bottle of Marmite I've ever seen in my life. What is this? And she said, but you know what, I love Marmite, but it's really expensive, you know. Like, I remember a couple of years ago, my son was about 4 months old, and every time I went to the shop, I really wanted to buy Marmite, really badly wanted to, because I love it so much, but it was just too expensive. And this happened for about 3 or 4 months. Every time I went shopping, I was like looking at the Marmite, like, I really want the Marmite, but I just couldn't get it. But after about 4 months, I was like, right, I'm just going to buy the Marmite. I don't care that it costs £3.50. I'm just going to buy the Marmite and just enjoy it. So I took it home, but at the time I had this guy sleeping on my sofa. He was on and off homeless, so I let him stay for a couple of nights, she said, on my sofa. He's actually a family friend. And when I woke up in the morning, he was making breakfast and he was making toast, and he ate nearly the whole thing of my Marmite, and I wanted to kill him. I was so annoyed. And every time I've seen him since, over the past 3 years, he always says to me, oh, I'm so sorry about your Marmite, I'm so sorry. And she's like, I still haven't forgiven him. But why am I telling you this story? Well, I thought to myself, I talk a lot about low income and working class people coming into the research profession and what the differences might be. And I thought, gosh, what if my cousin came into the profession now? You know, what kind of culture clashes would she be experiencing? How much would she feel she belongs? How much could she relate, and how much could others relate to her when these are the kinds of experiences you're having? I think most people in this room can probably agree we're not really thinking that much about the cost of Marmite as a part of our everyday lives. But you know, like Marmite, these issues are sticky. They're hard to sort of wade through. Not everyone likes them, and you know, they're difficult. And so here today, hopefully we can sort of start to just go through and wade through some of these sticky issues. But love it or hate it, like Marmite, these issues are here to stay. And hopefully by having conversations like this, we can make a difference. So without further ado, I'm going to pass on to Lee, who is going to go first on our panel.
Thanks, Ella. Thanks everybody for joining us today. And thanks for allowing me to set the scene for these wonderful speakers this afternoon. I'm going to draw on some of the findings from the very expansive study the Young Foundation did with almost 1,000 social researchers back in February. And they did it on behalf of the SRA, Power to Change, and Kantar Public. And before I forget, I need to say and acknowledge that this study that we're going to share with you was based and built on a previous study designed by Versity for the MRS. So I wanted to give props before I forget and then get into trouble. I'm pleased to be part of this webinar today because social class is something I'm really interested in. It's something I like to talk about. And my own experience is at the intersection of being from a minority ethnic group. I'm Chinese, my parents are from Hong Kong, a woman from a working class northern background. So my parents came over in the 50s. They left school to work in manual jobs. They were in catering, Chinese takeaways, all of their working life. And they left school without any qualifications higher than what we consider to be GCSE. So I grew up in the 70s and 80s as a takeaway kid in the Northeast. So that's my context and explains why I'm here today. And I'm really keen to hear what our speakers have got to say and suggest as a way forward in tackling the issues that Ella's teed up. So now for a short summary. I only want to take up a short amount of time because we've got some great speakers and I know Steve has to go very soon before 1 o'clock. So there is a big report that you can download from the Young Foundation website and the SRA website. Got loads of insight in it. I can only cover 2 or 3 things today. But if you're particularly interested in social class, there's a handy pullout on page 17 that pulls out the relevant findings about the social class perspective. So without further ado, the first insight I'm going to share with you, and it's probably obvious, but it's worth stating again, is that the social research profession is not perceived to be, or indeed is representative of wider society. And this is my first insight because this is highly problematic, given that many of us are in some way or shape or form involved in public policy, the formation of public policy, or in the allocation of important resources based on policy decisions that draw on the insight and the analysis and the research that we do. So we had a survey of 1,000 researchers and some qual insights too. And in the study, 7 in 10, that's 68%, said they agreed that the UK social research sector is far less diverse than the UK society in general. And if you've got the report or planning on downloading the report, that's figure 2 for those of you who love charts. Furthermore, the sample profile shows that 40% of the respondents, like me, are from the first generation to have gone into higher education. And that sounds okay, doesn't it? But actually it isn't. So when we invited social mobility expert, Professor Sam Freeman, to comment on the research back in July, he said that this is much lower than the 67% he would expect to see in the population. And like me, less than half attended a non-selective state school and 14% attended a private fee-paying school. And again, Sam Freeman pointed out that's double 7% he would expect to see in the population. So the profession is not as diverse in socio-cultural experience as we would like, and more needs to be done to improve access to and to retain the diverse range of people in the profession as they progress in their careers. We really don't want to lose that talent, and we really don't want to lose those important perspectives which are crucial for good policy making. I know both that Sinead and Jackie will talk about how to improve routes into becoming a social researcher and how to meet some of the challenges of research not being considered a first destination profession. I'm looking forward to that, and I'm not going to say any more. So the bulk of the study that the Young Foundation conducted really focused on the lived experience of working in the profession. And so the second insight is that we found the lived experience of working in the profession is felt differently for those from marginalised groups. And it is less positive as the number of marginalised characteristics increases. So, for example, I am from a BME background, I'm 50 plus, I'm a carer, so on and so forth. It seems the profession can struggle to include and accommodate for a diversity of identities. This is again problematic because it points to some very dominant cultures in research organisations, which makes even the best intentioned equality, diversity and inclusion practices hard to implement and hard to be successful, right? If you've got a culture that is fighting against that, people are swimming against the stream, against the current. So people who consider themselves to be of a working class background can feel uncomfortable and excluded at work. And that has implications for belonging and voice, which are the absolute pillars of inclusion. And this is partly down to a perceived dominance of a certain person, a certain mould within the profession from upper and middle class backgrounds. And Stephen from Stephen Lacey's organisation, working class people can feel like outsiders. And the qualitative interviews that the Young Foundation conducted showed some researchers felt less included by virtue of their social class and felt that their contributions were ignored. But it's not just feelings of belonging which are experienced differently, it's how fair the work environment is felt to be in terms of rewards and opportunities to prestigious projects and prestigious roles. And we've all been there, haven't we? We've wanted those opportunities, but they were just a bit out of our reach. And this is what Professor Sam Freeman calls the class ceiling. And it's sad to see that only a quarter, that's 24% of our study sample, believe there are equal opportunities to progress and fair rewards regardless of social class. And that's figure 9 in the report. And this varies by sector quite a bit. So I'm not going to go into the figures for each sector, but there is a pattern in the research. And as you read the report, you'll see the pattern is that the experience is less positive if you work in the third sector like myself, or in academia, where Jackie's from. And it's a little bit more positive if you're working in the public sector or for the commercial sector. So exclusionary behaviour does limit people's progression. And the special pull-out in the report talks about some of these exclusionary behaviours and these barriers. And these include questionable qualification requirements for jobs, and I've come across this recently, the requirement to have a postgraduate degree. And then there's London centrism, which I know some of our speakers will talk about. Jan in particular is going to talk a little bit about how IFF, where he's working, is trying to help staff develop skills, confidence, opportunities, and networks to facilitate their career progression. The final insight, I'm wrapping up very quickly, is that while organisations appear to value diversity and inclusion, and it is on their agendas, based on their experience, employees don't think the efforts so far have made the difference needed on the ground. And furthermore, social class is felt to be a priority for action. So we asked people in the study to rank the top 3 areas which they feel need to be prioritised for action within the profession. 2 issues stand out. The first is the need to continue to address discrimination and exclusion of people from minority ethnic backgrounds. So 3/4, that's 74% of the sample chose that as one of their top priorities. But second, the need to tackle the perceived elitist nature of the profession or social class disadvantage was chosen by 2/3, that's 67%. So this speaks to the need to acknowledge that social class is something that people feel needs to be tackled and focused on. The actions that organisations take in relation to diversity and inclusion in the workplace can sometimes miss the mark and be seen as reactive or performative. There needs to be investment in actions which empower staff, such as mentoring, sponsorship, staff networks, tailored leadership programs. But ultimately, there needs to be opportunities for people to progress and a way of making sure these dominant cultures are broken down. There is a real need for these changes. And I'm glad we're going to hear from a variety of speakers from different sectors who are going to give their view on how to create that real change for people on the ground. So this is the learning that the Social Research Association wants to facilitate and share at today's session. It is my pleasure as a trustee to set the scene for our speakers so that they can take the insight that the Young Foundation so ably extracted and help it turn into positive action. Thanks, Ella.
Thanks, Lee. Really great scene setting there. And I mean, as the report is aptly named, you know, there's still far to go. That's the name of the report, and I think probably how many of us on the panel and otherwise feel. So without further ado, I'm going to pass on to Steve Lacey.
Hello everyone, nice to meet you. So my name's Stephen Lacey and I run an agency, an insight agency called The Outsiders. I'm an ex-strategist, so I used to work for a number of advertising agencies, mainly on kind of big behavioural change projects. This is great to be here, and I think it's really, really important, and it's fantastic to have this conversation. I've been talking about class for a number of years, and I think it is very much the weakness that we don't have enough people from working class backgrounds within the industry. So a little bit about my background. So I'm disabled, I've got a lobster hand. I'm also neurodiverse, I'm dyslexic, and also I'm from a working class background. So my dad was a dustman, my mum come from a northern mining town, and my dad was also Irish, he's also Irish traveller. So I was brought up in a council estate, in quite a rough state in an area of London called Feltham. So this is something I feel really, really passionate about. I'm going to put some charts up. So let me just, get them up. So can you all see my screen? Can everyone see?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
great.
we can see it. Yeah.
So I'm going to talk a little bit about my experience. So this is my experiences of working in advertising and also working in the kind of research industry. So come from a working class kind of background, kind of had to smash a number of kind of doors to get in, to become a planner. I think it took me, a strategist, it took me about 10 years. When I entered the industry, there's a number of kind of experiences I had. The first thing is I felt straight away I had to kind of cover and mask my kind of identity. So my accent changed, try to lose accent, try to kind of get involved in different kind of conversation kind of points, and really try to change the way I spoke and the way I kind of behaved. Because of that, when I told people my background, sometimes people would be like, oh, what, you come from Feltham? You're a little bit too posh from Feltham. So you kind of got this kind of class, kind of snobbery and identity kind of coming through. I think the biggest thing I kind of felt was I felt very much a kind of the outsider. So I felt kind of lost in the coffee kind of conversations you would have. Going to the pub and having conversations with my colleagues, I couldn't really talk about skiing, know nothing about kind of horses, know nothing about kind of cycling, know nothing about rugby. So I felt very much kind of excluded and very much the kind of outsider during my time within the advertising and also the kind of research industry, because I felt I didn't have the conversation points. Another thing I kind of observed was a real kind of snobbery. So when people started to understand my identity more and that I was from a working class background, often got people kind of looking down on me a little bit. And I had it recently, a very, very smart kind of semioticician. He said, Steve, you're a fantastic presenter, but when you speak, your grammar is kind of wrong. So I had that feeling that I was constantly being looked down on. And that's not just in the industry, also outside the industry. So times when I've gone to look for a nice car, people kind of judge me by my kind of accent. Or when I've been in a restaurant, I kind of get certain kind of looks like, oh, you shouldn't really be there. I think in many ways, because I probably didn't have the right kind of academic language, that kind of created a feeling that I kind of felt incredibly kind of stupid. And that, in conjunction with my dyslexia, made me feel very, very insecure in the kind of conversations that I was having. Sometimes I didn't really know the right kind of words to kind of use, the kind of academic language to back things up. And sometimes I felt I just needed a dictionary to understand what people were kind of saying. I think the other thing is that once people found out that I was from a working class background, I suddenly got all the e-briefs. So suddenly it was like, oh, Steve, you can go and do those ones on that council estate because you kind of understand that audience. So in many ways, I felt I was becoming the representative of a certain kind of group. And then the last thing I kind of seen is I've seen a lot of others being judged. Ella, the wonderful chair that we have here, and myself, we set up an MRS group to kind of look at kind of class. And we had some transcripts, and one of our transcribers had the story of how she went to a client meeting and she got there before the research agency, and the client said hello to her and she had a conversation. The next day she got told off by the agency for having that conversation because that was not her place. So what are some of the kind of problems? Look, we love the kind of ABC1, C2, DE, etc. I think one of the things we kind of miss there is we miss the middle, and I talk a lot about that kind of middle. So the C1, C2 kind of joining together. The Conservative Party, love them, hate them. This isn't a political kind of statement, but the Conservative Party, through the Policy Exchange in 2016, got this, and they identified that middle, which is part of the reason why a lot of the red wall kind of collapsed. From a commercial point of view, and I think this kind of seeps through into many forms of research, we kind of worship at the altar of AB. Clients love to say that their audience is AB, and often in most cases, it's not. And I think this really leads to a really interesting kind of dilemma, because the audience that we buy against in terms of media, or the audience we kind of like, that AB audience, when you look at kind of a prototypicality, so a prototypicality, if you said to me, think of a bird, you think of something that flies. You don't think of a penguin. When people say kind of AB, what you end up with is a very wealthy, white, middle-aged man in Richmond who sends his kids to the private school, plays golf, goes skiing, or you get the Hampstead mum. You don't get the working class person in a northern town. You don't get a black working class person in Lewisham. They get excluded. And this has made me kind of think a lot about the industry. And I would say that I think this is the industry's strongest unconscious bias is around class. Because the prototypicalities that we think of when we think about class, what do we think of? What's the first things that come into our head? They're people who live in poverty. They're poor. They live in estates. They're uneducated. We need to educate them. We need to raise them to the standards. We need to save them. So we have a savior complex, which I would argue is inherited very much from kind of imperialism and kind of Victorian times. I think of Gladstone in the kind of the slums. The next one is the chavs. They're the annoying people that kind of spoil our kind of holidays. They're kind of the urban youth that we dislike and give this country a bad name. The next one is they're the health time bomb. They're the problems causing the strain on the NHS. They kind of drink too much. They're obese. They're all the kind of social problems. And it's interesting when you do C2DE from a commercial, and I don't know from a social, but you always get the social briefs. These are the people that we have to kind of save. Next one is they're the thick people. They're the thick people that voted for Brexit. And it was so interesting after Brexit. Most of my friends are in the research industry, and I just remember all the Facebook posts and LinkedIn posts, and people were just sneering. Oh, this is the uneducated, thick people who live in the kind of north who don't really understand what this country is. The next one is they're the kind of drunks. They're the people in Newcastle. You know, they're the kind of Sharons, they're the kind of terrible people that just have a good, they're hedonistic and they kind of have a good time, but they're just a bit of a disgrace to the nation. And the last one, especially with the white working class, is they're the far right. They're the people that are kind of embracing the kind of Union Jack in a negative kind of way and giving us all a bad name. So I nicked this from an inclusion kind of consultancy, and it talks about stereotypes. And in this model, there's different kind of dimensions. So you can have pity and sympathy if you think you have a warm relationship to something, but you think they're incompetent. You have contempt if you have a cold relationship and you think they're incompetent. If you have a cold relationship, but you think they're competent, then you have fear and envy. And the ultimate place is kind of warm and seeing them as competent. And I think this is how we see class. We have a cold and competent, the fear of class. We have contempt. These are the people that voted for kind of Brexit, the thick people. And then we have pity. So we have a multitude of negativities that kind of arise, which is a shame because they matter and they're an audience that's often ignored. They're large numbers. Estimates vary from 25% to VALs will take it up to 60%. You know, they're often people that we need to kind of have kind of conversations to. We don't always listen to them. And I'd argue that a lot of the people that did actually vote for Brexit was 20 years of not being listened to. But also, from a commercial perspective, they're often the people's clients and customers, and they're people's employees. And in many ways, they hold the key to power to number 10. But I think more importantly, we can learn a lot from them. They have, when I do work with them, I see a lot of positive attributes. They have a lot of respect for themselves and the community. They have a lot of decency. They care for their community, strong family networks, and they believe a lot in fairness. So I think they're an audience that we can really, really embrace. I'm not sure how much on time we've got. So I'm just going to just very quickly give you a few tips on how you research the working class. I think the first thing is treat it like an international project. Use experts, understand the culture. Have the right people on the ground that can really recruit the right kind of people that can get into the areas that research don't usually get, and get off the beaten track. We love Leeds and we love Manchester, and I used to love staying in the Malmaison, but there's so many other places that need to be researched. And my last point, which is quite controversial, is don't overplay on empathy. It's a lot of, I think research is getting mixed up with empathy and insight. Insight's not empathy. Some of the biggest bastards I've ever worked for had no empathy, but they were fantastic at insight. Empathy is important. We have to have that. We have to have that as a moderator. But the problem I see is what people do is, oh, we do a couple of decks with teenage mums and we've gone to an estate and we really, really know them and we really understand their lives from these depths. Now we go back, we do our analysis session, we're going to put ourselves in that person's shoes. What should we do? And the solution I hear time and time again is educate them, which again, I think is an overall class bias that's coming through. And that finishes my presentation.
Amazing, thank you, Steve. That's great. I'm going to ask you to keep your camera on because I know you have to run off in just a minute. There was a couple of questions there that have come up for you. So someone has said, really interesting. They were a census field officer this year, and people they knew were calling her brave for doing the job in her town's less upmarket areas. She's from a lower middle class family. Both parents left school at 16. Has not and never had an issue talking to a range of people, but did find other people struggled with it during the census on the doorstep. How do you square the right people on the ground with your experience of being given the council estate brief?
So I think you have to find the right people on the ground. So what I've actually done is I've actually found people that I thought were very, very outgoing, and I've actually trained them to be my recruiters. So I've got people that can really get into that ground. I remember having a brief about domestic abuse, and we were trying to find domestic abusers. So we had to get someone on an estate who knew the women that were regularly getting the black eyes, so we could speak to their partners. So I think it's hard, and I think it's a challenge. I think in many ways, not all recruiters, but a lot of kind of recruiters, they're comfortable as well. Yeah, they don't like going outside their comfort zone, and their comfort zone is usually C1, C2. You start getting to the D and E's, it gets tricky and it gets hard. I've heard people say, I don't really want those kind of people in my home. Yeah. And that's another bias that's kind of coming through. Yeah. And you see that in working class communities, actually. I think one of the interesting things about working class communities is actually how judgmental they are of different kind of groups. And I talk a lot about, you've got one group that is, I call the salt of the earth, but they're very, very traditional working class, yeah? Very black and white, very judgmental, haven't been more than five miles for 3 generations. Then you've kind of got the strugglers who are earning less than £10,000 a year. The people that judge them most are the salt of the earth who live in the same community, because they say, you're the scrounger, you're the person giving us a bad name. So if our recruitment is centered on the salt of the earth, it's going to be really, really difficult to have the strugglers, because they have their own biases. Yeah.
Yeah, and then also I think there's a linked question, and we can talk about this a bit later as well, but just about in terms of the right people on the ground, in terms of who's conducting the research. And I always think it's interesting, there's a big tendency now towards sort of matching researchers with participants, and I'm not always sure. I don't necessarily think that's always the best way. I think personally that you need a mix. You need the emic and the etic, the inside and the outside. And for me, that's what I feel is always most successful. But like you, I was often given the council estate briefs and sent around the country.
100% agree. So I did a project recently about mental health and young black males from working class backgrounds on estates. Yeah, so I did some of the research myself. I worked with a black moderator, but what I also did is I spoke to lots of experts, from One Extra's kind of editorial director to academics, to a whole range of experts, so that I had a bit of a cultural kind of context before I kind of went in there. So that helped, and then I used that at the back end of the analysis session. But I think the matching bit is important, but that's sometimes where we're flipping empathy and insight, because you can be middle class or upper class, but you can still have really good insights and be able to spot an insight. Yeah, it's not a prerequisite. They're not interconnected.
Absolutely agreed. Thank you, Steve. If any other questions for you come up in the next 5 minutes, I will try and bring them back, or maybe if you could answer in the chat, because I think we're going to move on to Jackie now. So thank you so much.
Hello everybody, I hope you can hear me. Steve, when you were speaking, I was nodding my head vigorously, both from side to side and up and down, all the way through everything you were talking about, because it resonated so deeply with my own experiences, which I'm going to talk a little bit about now. But I'd also like to reflect on some of the issues that both yourself and Lee have brought up pertaining to the recent research. I was quite nervous about coming on this panel today. I actually chaired my own panel earlier in the week, which had a stellar cast on. And I was mindful of coming on here today and feeling, I don't know, feeling maybe a bit like this isn't my usual space, right? And I think what that has helped me think deeply about is what I bring to this panel. So what I'm going to talk about now, I think, is my own perspective, which has relevance because of the journey that I've had. Right, so I just want to set that out in terms of context. And what is my context? I think our contexts are really, really important in shaping what we say and how we act and what we do. So like Lee, I was a first gen university student, and I've made a few notes for myself here. And when thinking about this, I've written down people like me didn't go to university. Unlike my friend who I sat in a classroom with, who was actually probably my competitor, you know, at the tender age of 7 or something, my friend Diane, who we always knew would become a lawyer, right? So Diane came from a professional family. I didn't. My dad was a tailor's cutter, and then he worked in the evenings and made suits. on the side. My mum was a mum of 6 kids, and then when she could go back to work, she was a dinner lady. So I sort of came from that background, and I was somewhere in the middle. And actually, the Marmite story, Ellie, you told, what that brought back memory-wise for me was that we used to go to the supermarket walking because my mum didn't drive. You know, it's a 2-mile walk to Asda and there and back, and we'd help her carry the bags. My mum regularly used to have to put produce back. She'd get it onto the to be scanned, and then she didn't have enough money in her purse, so she'd have to put things back. So, you know, that story didn't talk to me about love it or hate it. It talked to me about real lack of resources to be able to afford food for family on the table. Anyway, so I'm just sort of throwing that in there just to give some context to how I grew up. I grew up in Leeds, suburban Leeds, and now I am a professor in statistical literacy. Well, how on earth did that happen? I'll tell you how it happened. It took me 3 careers. So when I did go to university, I dropped out after a year, and then I went back and finished my degree. And when I completed my degree, I had no idea what I was going to do. So I drifted into teaching in secondary school. And I taught in secondary school, and then I found myself a single parent with 2 small children under the age of 3 in my 30s. And I went back into education. And I did a master's degree, a conversion master's, and then I came second in the year and was advised that I should think about doing a PhD. You know, I'd never in a million years thought about doing a PhD before because I hadn't done well at my first degree. Nonetheless, I did, and as a single parent, I did my PhD, and then ended up working in higher education for almost 20 years, but not as an academic. I worked in that liminal space between academia and between the world of work. Let's just sum it up like that. And then I won a big grant from the Nuffield Foundation to set up this internship program, which I'm going to talk about, this paid internship program. And that's really what I'm now known for. But what that's enabled me to do is, first of all, appreciate in my own life the value of education, but also bring that into the lives of the students that I now teach. And the undergraduate students I now teach are social science students. So, you know, they're the candidates that could go into social research careers, even though at the age of 18, when they tend to come to university, they don't know anything about what a social research career looks like. So that's a really important finding. I'm a late bloomer. I'm really proud now to be a late bloomer, but it's taken me 30 years to sort of shed that shame label that I've carried around with me, both because of my working class background and not being good enough, but also because I never fit in. You know, I didn't fit into teaching. I didn't fit into this strange space I was occupying between higher education and the world of work. And then when I became an academic, I didn't really fit into being an academic either, because most of them are good at school, they're good at college, they're good at university, and then they go on and become academics. And now what I do is make much of not fitting in. And I'm saying that because I'm sure there are people who are listening today who probably feel similar. You know, where do I fit? And if you're anything like me, you don't, but I've made a strength of that. And what I've done, and I'm going to show you, I don't have slides, but I do have a prop. And I'm going to hold up my book, which is called Work Placements, Internships and Applied Social Research. And I published that with Sage Publishers in 2021, April this year. And the book reflects lived experiences and narratives and stories through vignettes and case studies of people who have done work placements whilst they've been studying, not always at undergraduate levels, but also at PhD and master's levels. And it also includes 3 vignettes in there in one of the chapters about what can you do with a social science degree if you want to go into social research, because I've deliberately included social research on my title. And I interviewed 3 people, one from Ipsos Mori, one from the Future Foundation, and one from NatSen. And I've got their stories as early career researchers talking about what a career in social research is like. So that doesn't feed off directly from the subject of class, but what does feed off the subject of class is that in the 7 years I've been running this program, about 6 years because we had a year off for the first year of COVID, I've now placed 300 students. 25% of those have been from widening participation, stroke less advantaged backgrounds, or underrepresented groups. And 70%, in fact, 80% this year have been female. So I believe firmly that because I have created this program as an inclusive opportunity, that people do come forward. And moreover, because I put a lot of time and effort and thought into creating support structures for those young people, they get what they need, both in terms of applying, doing, reflecting on, and using it in their future. And I want to talk a little bit about that more, if I may, because first of all, I've got three pieces of advice. One is don't be the bystander. Okay, I've learned, it's taken me a long time to learn to be the person that speaks out. So I now aim to be the voice in the room I want to hear. And I'm finding that people really embrace that. So if I stand up and say something about my background and, you know, here I am as a professor now, but I didn't become a professor until my 50s, people's eyes sort of, you know, widen, or their ears are more alert. So I now try to speak out about the sorts of pathways we can have into careers that support social research. And in my case, that's about education. We want to have a social research profession that has all those voices in the room, and yet what we're hearing from this report is they're somehow latent. You know, so somehow we have to ensure that the voices are heard. And it's not just about fixing people, and it's not just giving people assertiveness training, it's truly listening to people, but also speaking out. The second thing I want to be is to try to be the person. This is what I try. So I'm giving advice as if I were giving it to myself. Try to be the person in someone's life you wish you'd had when maybe you were their age, or when you were trying to sort of start out on your career. We talk a lot about mentoring, and I'm seen as a mentor. I'm somebody who sort of supports and helps a lot, particularly of young women, but also people from less advantaged backgrounds. However, I don't think it's enough just to mentor. I think what we need to do is the word that Lee used at the start about sponsor. We need to be proactively opening doors to people, not only to give them access either into, in my case, a university through widening participation schemes, or access into the workplace through work placements, paid work placements, but we need to be providing access to them through their careers. So we have this clear route of both access to and progression through a career. And that takes energy and effort and foresight and connections and all the things that Steve was talking about, but we have to be very proactive to make that happen. And it didn't happen for me until later in my life. I've never really had a mentor. I've never really had anybody sort of champion me. And I think what I try to do now is be that person. I had one person who really sort of saw my potential and helped me get to where I am. And that's why I try to give back. And, you know, small things like being an accountability partner. I go to events, I talk, I sit next to young people and talk. They often then contact me and say, that was all I needed, not just to give me confidence, but to give me the spur to do what you challenged me to do. And then we tend to keep in touch. I keep in touch with all of the people who reach out, and then I help them become the people that they're capable of being. And then the third piece of work, and this speaks to the EDI component of what we're all talking about today. And I've taken this, many of you will know, Deeds Not Words, from the Pankhurst Trust. Well, I work with Helen Pankhurst directly. I sit on a group in Greater Manchester for Women 2028 that we are looking to do a lot of work around gender inequality. And we've got the strapline, deeds, words, and determination. And I think the determination perhaps is the missing ingredient here. It's not missing, but it needs to be more evident. And so people like me talking about things like this, and everybody on the panel, you know, we really are truly determined to do this, but we have to act on these determinations as well. And for me, in terms of my own personal reflections, not just my own, but listening to the people on the panel today, I think speaking up and speaking out is really hard to do, but can be incredibly powerful. So, you know, this the Maya Angelou quote, isn't there, that people will forget what you said, but they'll never forget how you made them feel. And Steve, that absolutely speaks to what you were saying about. And there's a couple of books I've read which really, really stuck with me. One is Respectable by Lindsay Hanley. She's a journalist, and she's currently on Radio 4, I think, talking about neighbourhoods. And the other, which was tremendously powerful, is this book, which is a compilation of stories called Know Your Place. And it's working class voices talking about not just how they feel, but how they feel when they, particularly on being educated, you never quite feel that you belong. So Lindsay Hanley talks about, you know, never being able to go back to where she grew up and live in the same way, and never quite being able to occupy the space that she's professionally developed into. And that speaks so deeply, because I feel very much the same. But what I've decided to do, and this might be oversharing, but I'm sharing it now, because in 2019, this is relevant, okay? My son collapsed at the wheel of his car. He had a seizure, and it turns out he had a brain tumor. My son is a GP, right? So from my first generation background, I've got a son who's a GP, one who's works in the government in civil service, and a daughter who's just graduated, so 3 graduates. My son, who's a GP, was 32 when he collapsed at the wheel of his car with a brain tumor, okay, an incurable brain tumor. And for me, what that has done is set into train my complete desire and commitment to make the rest of my life matter in whatever way it can. And so what I'm doing now is speaking on platforms like this, because I think it's so crucially and utterly important that people who do have a platform can speak out in a way that might encourage and support and inspire other people to do it sooner. And just wrapping up then, yeah, what do I want to say? Well, everything that Steve said is, you know, so true. We need to not only hear more voices, but we need to listen to them. We need to not make those wild assumptions that all of those images that you put up, Steve, reminded me of what I put up in the classroom when I'm teaching inequalities, you know, global inequalities particularly. What do people take away from those sorts of images? But how can we, as a profession and as the educational pipeline in that profession, how can we get better at giving opportunities that are rewarded to those people who will not just go into the social research career, but progress through it? So I think I'm going to leave us with a hanging question, and I'm very happy to take any questions from the floor.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Jessie. That was really generous of you. I really enjoyed you speaking. So in the chat, just a couple of things. So someone's talking about the use of the language of disadvantage. So saying it's interesting that we refer to people from widening access backgrounds as disadvantaged. Disadvantage is relative. Although I was considered disadvantaged, they say in the context of my university, I was relatively advantaged in the context of my community. And wording can be important because it affects the way people view widening access programs and whether or not they are relevant to them. So just wondered if you had any thoughts.
Yes, I do. And thank you, whoever made that comment. And when I use a term, I really don't like the term disadvantage for the very reason that you have pointed out, that it is relative, and it, you know, what one person perceives as disadvantage, another person wouldn't. And I did write down, and I didn't actually cover it, this whole deficit narrative that accompanies talking about working class deeply, deeply, deeply troubles me, okay? And I'm not sure quite how to square that, because on the one hand, you end up feeling like, what's the Monty Python sketch about, you know, the hole in the road and everything, you know, we had less than you, that sort of whole negative, which is not what we want to do. On the other hand, how do we frame working class roots? Let me just, for my purposes, encapsulate it like that. How do we frame what we bring along as people from working class backgrounds in a way that embraces all of the good things about it? Okay, and I try to do that with my students, but it's really hard to get the balance right, because you don't want to step over the other side and end up with that horrible positive, you know, toxic positivity about, yeah, but resilience this, and yeah, if only we sort of did this, and aren't we good at this? Because that dilutes, actually, that lessens the lived experience, the emotion, everything that we've been talking about. So I don't have an answer to that, but I'm really glad that person raised it, and I'm really sorry that I didn't, because I've actually challenge the deficit narrative on one of my cards, and I do talk about that.
Yeah, I think linked to that actually is this idea of social mobility and climbing up and leaving something behind. And I'm always a bit like, I'm not sure that's what we necessarily want to bring. Actually, what we want to bring is a different perspective. We don't want to lose where we've come from. That's what I personally feel is.
Yeah, no, I agree. And that different perspective, you know, we're gathering it in the data, but are we actually eliciting it in the insight through the analysis of the data? That's my big question. Or are we hiding it because we're frightened to speak out?
And yeah, I'm sure there's a mix of those things happening, I'm sure, across the spaces. Thank you so much, Jackie. We are going to move on now to Sinead.
Hello. Hello, hi everybody. My name is Sinead Hassan. I am founder and managing director of a recruitment agency called Hassan Associates. I have been recruiting within the research industry, not just social research, but the whole research industry since 1996, so quite a long time. I also sit on the Market Research, Diversity, Inclusion and Equality Council, and I'm really pleased to be invited onto this panel today, because this is really such a key topic, and it is clear from the number of participants and from the comments that everybody is very engaged in this subject. I have been, as I said, recruiting since 1996 within this sector, and I've seen huge amounts of change, primarily in the use of technology, in how that has enhanced and developed research methodologies, increasing data science. Research is significantly more sophisticated than it was when I started working within this sector. Culturally, organizations have also changed, but that change is slower in relation to the change within the products and services offered by the sector. There is a better gender balance than there was when I started. And even without the impact of COVID, flexible working was being embraced, creating better working environments for people. The employer-employee relationship has changed, definitely. And we, as individuals, are encouraged to bring our whole selves to work. And the employer is encouraged to embrace that. Belonging is a really common value within market research agencies, within client organizations. Belonging is a key value, and it's really interesting from this study that belonging was one of the key gaps, and even from Steve's conversation earlier, not belonging was an issue for lots of people in career development. So I think that's really, really interesting. Everybody's talking about diversity. We're talking about it. I did a panel last week about diversity. The MRS is talking about it. Everybody is talking about it. And I think, as Jackie said, you know, it has to be deeds, not words. The conversations tend to be most commonly around gender, ethnicity, sexuality, age, ability. And the question of social class is not always considered. As Steve said, it's possibly the biggest bias in the industry. And I think it's really important that we're talking about it. I think that the research industry at C-suite level is still very heavily pale, male, and middle class. I think at the entry level, it's beginning to change, but it's very, very slow, and it's too slow, to be honest. One of the things that we often talk about is that there are a huge range of roles for people to consider and careers for people to consider. And market research and social research is a real challenge to stand out from the crowd. It is a professional service, and I think that's one of the issues. It's probably one of, if you look at all the professional service, it's the one that's sort of least glamorous, least interesting, and the one that people are probably less aware of. As recruiters, we talk to lots of different companies. We talk to managing directors and HR managers and hiring managers. and we talk to them about what they need. It's what we do all the time. And then we talk to, you know, people who are looking for roles, and we're trying to match what is best for people. One of the triggers, I think, that causes some of the greatest bias is that 80% of our clients will say, this person must be a graduate, this person must have a degree. We challenge that, we do, and the response, and I've spoken to my team about this, the response ranges from, well, we're a consultancy, so we need really strong academics. We need bright people. Our intellect is our product. And what really frustrates me about that is that they are assuming that the only reason people don't go to university is because they aren't bright enough. And that is clearly not the reason that people don't go to university. And it's a real shortcoming from the employers within this sector that they make that a requirement. And there are lots of other ways in which to measure somebody's intellect that does not involve a degree. It's hard enough, to be honest, because sometimes they say they have to have a Russell Group degree and ideally somebody from Oxbridge. And myself and my colleagues across the recruitment landscape within this sector are frequently battling that one. And it's tough. So I think that's a kind of key barrier for people coming into this sector. There are ways around it now because there are lots of new initiatives coming in that allow school leavers to get into the research sector. The Market Research Society has just launched a brilliant apprenticeship scheme, and they've already got apprentices running through that. The Market Research also has an advanced certificate in research methods. And I think there's somebody here actually who's just done that, who's carried out that study, and with the help of a bursary from the MRBA. And if you're a school leaver and you've gone into market research, you can then do that qualification, and that upskills you. That is a degree level qualification. So I think what happens is people who don't go in that graduate route can also feel that they're slightly at a disadvantage when they get further down the line, when they're 5 years in and they're looking for a promotion. That can also happen for people, and that can be really helpful. So that's something to look out for. There are other ways if you're a school leaver, and if you know a school leaver who you think might be interested in research, then I think there are lots of, the apprenticeship scheme is useful. There's a new initiative of 10,000 Black interns, which is just starting this year, which the market research industry is also supporting. And this is fairly typical, lots of people enter the market research industry through the ops route. So a school leaver who hasn't gone to university may also go in through the ops route. But the question of the understanding of the importance of hiring across the class system is totally missed out in the market research industry. And one of the things that I also thought was really interesting in this study was this question about cultural capital. And I think it's really interesting. And some of that also is London-centric, which somebody had also mentioned in the study. And I think that this is a learning point for people who are hiring, because if you're hiring, you sometimes look for people who are like you, who you've got something in common with. If you don't have that cultural capital, possibly because of how you grew up or where you grew up, then that may cause an impact on your performance in an interview or a promotion. And what tends to happen is people hire people like them. And then that becomes kind of a self-fulfilling inability for people to create real diversity. So what we advise our clients to do is to drop any internal referral scheme, which are pretty common in organizations, until you've got greater diversity, and to actively go out and recruit in different environments. What I would also say, if you're looking at social class in particular, is that you need to use your most experienced interviewers to interview people who come from different backgrounds, because it's no good an Oxford graduate interviewing somebody Steve talked earlier about not knowing about skiing or horse riding or, you know, shooting and fishing. You know, you have to have variety in your interview panel so that people can find what is common for them to talk about to make them feel confident. And one of the areas that I find that people who come from working class backgrounds where they struggle a little bit more is around that cultural capital and around confidence in communication. And then that all leads to this issue of lack of belonging, and that affects progress. And there is so much more that organizations can do. And I know Jan is going to talk particularly about what they do at IFF. There's more that organizations can do. I would also say to people who are struggling in this particular area that there are really good mentoring groups. You can engage a mentor who will help you overcome those hurdles. Market Research Society have a really good mentoring scheme. Women in Research also have a really good mentoring scheme. And I've mentored a number of different people over the years and really helped them with some of those issues where they felt they weren't good enough, they didn't belong, they were overlooked, and they didn't fit in. And if you're a really good researcher, that's your capital. If you're brilliant at your job, that's the thing that's important. And I've always really strongly believed that in the mantra, you cannot be what you cannot see. And what we need are for people who have really strong lived experiences of coming into the sector, like Ella, brilliant advocate for this, and Steve, to talk more about their experience and what they've done. And that will only lead to a much higher uptake of people coming into the sector, and also people being happy to say who they are, where they come from, without feeling like they don't fit in, and that's going to put them at a disadvantage. So to conclude, I want to say that social research is really a great career. There's lots of people on this chat who are studying social research. It's a great opportunity. The world that we currently live in needs more really great social researchers. I think we've all learned a huge amount about what's been happening and how we can impact it through research. So I would really encourage those of you who are thinking about a career in research to really stick with it. There are great organizations there. They need further education on, and this study is really helpful for companies. They need further education, but the more people who are there, the better it will be. So thank you. If you've got any questions, let me know.
Thank you so much, Sinead. That was yeah, really, really helpful, really interesting. We had some questions in the chat. I was just trying to follow along the chat while you were talking there, and there was something about bringing your whole self to work, which I think is quite an interesting one. So someone, you know, said, oh, there's all this talk of that, but is it that I just don't work in a place that feels inclusive enough for me to do that, or is it just like what are the lines?
I think that well, I think that the most successful employer-employee relationships are one where there's a really good culture match. And I think you should be able to bring your whole self to work. If you can't, then sometimes there's a bit missing, so you're not going to get as much out of it as possible. I absolutely know that there are some people who don't, but in the right organization, I really believe you can bring your whole self to work, be who you are, and that adds to the value of your experience and your expertise. So yes.
Yeah, and I think Lee answered in the chat as well to say, well, actually, some people might want to keep something back, and that is also a choice. And actually, being able to do both of those things, I think.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
Totally.
Thank you, Sinead. I don't have any other questions right now, but we are going to come back together at the end. So I'm going to move on to Jan, our final panelist.
Thanks, Ella. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for the previous speakers. Okay, I'm Jan. I'm the MD of IFF Research, which is a social and public policy research agency based in London. So I'm here to talk about the employer's perspective. Slightly daunting speaking, but also slightly daunting speaking about my organisation. I want to avoid giving you sort of the recruitment brochure view of IFF, of selling us as having completely cracked social diversity and inclusion in our workforce. We haven't yet, but we're going to. I don't want to give you an impression that things are awful either. I don't want to say that all my team, my colleagues, they're a homogenous bunch of middle-class Oxbridge graduates. They're not, we're not, and I'm certainly not. So we're somewhere in between. We're on a journey, as so many people have been talking about, and as so many people of you, I'm sure, are. As we've grown as a company, we've grown quite a lot over the last few years. Our senior team has sort of gained experience, and we've gained in confidence in our ability to run a business our way, the way that we want to, and to be the sort of business that we want. And in that process, we've started to pay more attention to who we are, what we look like, and what we represent, I guess. So I'm going to try to share with you in a quick time some highlights of what we've learned, what we've done, what we plan to do. I've got about 10 points that I want to try to get across, hopefully in 10 minutes. So I'll try not to talk too quickly, although I understand that is one of my key defaults. I'll start off talking a bit about me. Everyone has, so only fair that I do as well. I've got one of those immigrant backstories that only cities like London can throw up. My dad is from Guyana, which is, it's Guyana, not Ghana, it's just off the, in South America, just off the West Indies. He came to this country as a 17-year-old back in the early 60s. He got a job in a factory making cardboard boxes, and then eventually took himself forward, forged a career in the civil service. My mum came from Norway a few years later. She was originally an au pair, then she became a school dinner lady, and latterly a school secretary in a school where her qualification was her ability to speak Norwegian rather than anything else. Neither of my parents had a formal education beyond the age of 16, but like many immigrants, they had a very strong belief in education. I grew up in a council estate in Sutton, and both my sister and I attended selective state schools and managed to get into university. I'm married. I have a wonderful white English Oxbridge educated partner from Surrey, who's also my business partner. I'm straight, I'm cisgender. I'm probably a bit more woke than some of my friends, but probably a little bit less woke than many other people. We've got 4 kids, all of them go to state school, and they mock me mercilessly and continuously about not being working class anymore. And I think that speaks to sort of the journeys and movement that people were talking about. Now, I say all that partly in the interest of sharing and transparency, and because we're telling our stories and our context where we come from, but also it talks to the highlights of not just of intersectionality, I think, but sort of the transience of classification systems, and particularly where they apply to notions of class and economic advantage, in my sense, and that's important, right? Anyway, moving on from me to talk about IFF. That's what I'm here to talk about. I want to talk about some of the things that we've done. So, true to form, we started our inclusion journey with measurement and categorization. So we conduct now an annual staff characteristics survey, and we also track the characteristics of all applicants and employees throughout the recruitment process and through their life at IFF. Now that sounds obvious, we're researchers after all, but it's not something that we at IFF were doing before, and I bet it's not something that's universally done across the sector, or certainly in the wider world. And it's probably not done because it's not easy. There are all kinds of challenges involved. Our journey, our way through, we've worried in particular about the impact that asking certain questions about people, about their characteristics, the impact that might have on new candidates, whether they be interested in IFF or not. I guess that speaks to what Sinead was just saying about cultural fit, right? So the people who are happy perhaps to answer questions probably fit more with our notions of what the workplace should be like. There's questions about how you store data, etc. And there's questions critically about what are the questions that one should ask in order to identify and group and classify people. Now, in terms of class, we want to ask 3 questions of people. One which is about the qualifications that they hold or held at the age of 25. One's about highest parental qualifications, and the last is about whether or not they'd received any free school meals at any stage of their schooling. Now, I know those questions aren't perfect, right? That's 3 questions that are not perfect, but we've taken the view that rather than get into lots of discussions about getting the perfect questions, that the best thing to do is to start by starting, right? So that if you repeat something over time, it's definitely much better than doing nothing over time. So that's our first 2 learnings, and the first 2 things we've done, I suppose, are my 10 points. Start off by measuring as early in the appointment cycle as possible, and start by starting. Nothing is perfect, but something is progress. Okay, what else do we learn in terms of recruitment? That process of measuring the characteristics of candidates and employees hasn't really told us much that we didn't know or that we didn't suspect at least, but we gained some clarity as to where we are, and it sets a benchmark against which we can sort of measure our progress. And one of the key things that it's thrown up is the marked difference, which Sinead was just talking about, in the characteristics of our research team compared to our ops team and compared to our panel of interviews. And by and large, the short story is that our interviewers are a much more diverse group, and a larger proportion of them come from lower income backgrounds. No great surprises there, right? Sure, it's typical of the industry we work in. But where we go with that, it's one of the key things we're doing. Again, something Sinead just talked about, is that we've made a very determined effort and objective to offer routes into executive employment for our interviewers. So at IFF, we take on somewhere between 2 and 6 trainee research executives. Used to call them graduate researchers, but we'll come on to that in a minute. They're trainee research executives, take on 2 to 6 a year. And we've set an objective that at least one of those each year should be an ex-interviewer. And that's an objective which we've met easily, we've exceeded. So we make sure that our recruitment intakes take on ex-interviewers. In a similar vein, our people team is challenged more fundamentally sort of the criteria against which we have traditionally recruited people into executive positions. So historically, again, much as Sinead was talking about this now, we have been looking for degree-educated candidates, preferably people who've done postgraduate degrees, something which is mentioned in the SRA report about the exclusive nature of that type source of recruitment. And we've tended to prefer Russell Group universities. Right? Now, that's in IFF, and again, I say we're laying some of our dirty laundry out here. We have a senior team which includes several members who aren't degree educated, many who haven't attended Russell Group universities, many who don't have postgraduate degrees, yet it had seeped into our way of recruiting that that's what we should be looking for, right? And it's something we're changing. We're focusing increasingly on competency, on psychometric testing, on other ways of doing it. And it's harder, right? It's harder, it takes more resource, it's a different type of recruitment. But ultimately, look, the research industry is one where we are a proper people business. We're only as good as the people we employ, and if we don't put the resource right to getting the right people in, then we won't be the agencies that we want to be. We've also engaged an external diversity and inclusion consultant to review all elements of our recruitment and our employment practices to try to identify those blind spots that we might have. And they've helped us with a number of things. And, again, it speaks to something some of our previous speakers have talked about, some of those kind of unconscious or sort of clumsy sort of ways in which you can bring in bias. So we had a question within one of our recruitment phases, which was asking people what would they do if they could have a year off. Now, nothing necessarily wrong with that as a question, but I guess it's the question of what are you looking for in that response? Now, if you're expecting people to have wildly exotic sort of ideas, notions of going to different places and sort of spending it in exotic fields, etc., that kind of assumes a background which perhaps not everyone shares. And there are different ways in which you can answer that question, which perhaps are less favoured or could be less favoured than others. So focusing on that potential for unconscious bias has been really important in terms of that review that our EDI consultants have brought us. They didn't just outline things which weren't going well for us, they also talked about things which were going pretty well. And one of which was our sort of very staunch belief in flexible working and remote working. And again, this predates the pandemic, but it's something which IFF, we very strongly believe that where and when people work is less important than the work that they do, right? Now, there are obvious ways in which flexible working promotes diversity inclusion. You think of parents, you think of carers, etc. But the remote working that we've all had to experience over the last couple of years, is also proving a great way of challenging what the SRA report describes as the London centricity of the research industry. We assumed that certainly people coming in would have to be in London, they have to come to the office. And it's told us, this period has told us, well, that's not necessarily true. And when one can start to consider applicants and candidates who perhaps don't have the means to move to London, to live in London, then that opens up the field of people whom you can employ, whom you can recruit from tremendously. So those next three lessons then sort of use interview roles as a springboard for people to get into executive roles, make use of external consultants, review everything that you do from the ground up, so that you can wheedle out all those potential biases, and champion and promote remote working opportunities as a means to get over London centricity and other potential biases. Am I doing? Yeah, I'm okay for time for a bit. What else have we done in terms of progression? It's not just about recruitment. Getting our progression routes right is, of course, critical for us to be the truly inclusive employer that we want to be. So we've become, in that way, we've become really explicit about what it takes to be successful, to move between different levels of our organisation, between different jobs. So what we've been really explicit about what you need to do to achieve promotion. Now that's, nothing I'm saying here, I guess, is really mind-blowing and sort of groundbreaking potentially, but it is something which I have to confess we were initially fearful of, right? And I think a lot of employers are. And when you try to break down the fear, why is one fearful of being absolutely explicit? And I suppose it comes from a couple of things. The first is that there's a sense in which, as an employer, you want the business, you want yourself, you want the people whom you delegate recruitment processes and promotion processes to have discretion, right, about whom they favour. That's kind of almost baked into how a business is built to think, right? And it's kind of understandable, it's rational from a business perspective that we, the business, makes decisions, right? And we think that we can do so rationally and without bias. But perhaps we can't, perhaps we don't. And making, it's that kind of discretion which can allow unconscious biases to come into our decision making, right? So discretion is actually the enemy, I think, in this sense, and explicit codification of the things which you're looking for really helps. The second fear that we had, I guess, was that our colleagues would become more focused on their personal advancement if we shared very explicitly, this is what you need to do in order to progress with the company and to get the next promotion. So their focus, it draws the employees' focus to their personal advancement rather than on the advancement of the company, the benefit of the company. Now, again, that's a hard thing for us to admit, right? But that's the point of sessions like this. It's the point of the process that we're going through, right? You have to face up to some hard truths about how you think. And that is how traditionally a lot of business think, and I think that's traditionally how IFF thought. But what we're trying to focus on now is sort of more of that mutual benefit and the adult-to-adult relationship, which I think speaks to what Sinead was talking about, really, in terms of the relationship between employer and employee needs to be reframed differently. And one can be explicit about these things. It doesn't necessarily mean that everything moves in the way that everyone wants, but you have a grown-up adult-to-adult conversation rather than things being done with discretion in an unsaid way and without full understanding of who gets where, when. And that's been one of the most difficult parts of our journey so far, but we've made a step, we made a promise, we've made ourselves accountable for making that promise. Another part of that, I guess, is baking pastoral career support into the system through the line manager network, and that's something which we've worked on really extensively as well. But I can see the time's moving on, so I'll perhaps skip over that. But another couple of things, I suppose, that we've done there. So it's being public and explicit about how people progress through an organisation, about the rules, the things that you look out for, and ensuring that people have the support that they need to help them to understand what they need to do to progress. So those things go hand in glove. Just to finish off, a couple of things that she planned to do, I suppose, and which, well, I suppose, a couple of things that she planned to do, which I want to talk about, which I think are really important to get us where we want to be. First of all, is that we're moving towards reporting pay gaps against other characteristics than gender. I think pay gap reporting to me is something which has been a great advance in the workplace over the last few years. Now we are working actively to calculate and release our ethnicity pay gap figures, and we're also looking to release pay gap figures against other characteristics, including social class. And that measurement that I talked about at the start and that classification of people will allow us to do that. And I think the hard facts of measurement and seeing some hard data on pay gaps and making that public is something which will really help us to move forward. Janae just mentioned the stuff, the 10,000 Black Interns program. That's something which IFF has signed up to. The yeah, the MRS apprentice is great. It's great to see that finally coming off the road. And I think there's more the MRS can potentially do to promote progression into the sector earlier than the university stages. And along those lines, just wanted to give a final special mention, a shout out to an organisation which we work with at IFF called Future Frontiers. It's an organisation which facilitates career coaching for young people in years 10 to 12 who come from lower income backgrounds, right? And the idea is that they work with us. We nominate a number of mentors, usually about 15 to 20 mentors who work on a one-to-one basis with a young person from a disadvantaged background over a period of 10 weeks. They come to, from a lower income background, I should say, they come to our offices. They get to see not just the IFF office, but also to talk more generally about what career opportunities they might want to pursue, and the idea is that our mentors will help them to push the boundaries of what they might be thinking about and what they might be exposed to. And it's really a wonderful scheme. It's always one of the highlights of my year, or it used to be before pandemic, when you'd see these 20 young people sort of sitting in our offices chatting about what their career could be, and sort of how much they open up about what they could be looking for. And I think getting involved with things like that, brilliant for the wider world. It's brilliant for our organisation. It's a great way for our people to get experience of talking to younger people, those year 10s to 12s, whom they might not get a chance to speak to, and particularly when they're coming from different backgrounds themselves. So yeah, extend pay gap reporting, look out for promote, encourage sector-wide recruitment activities, and look for outreach through the likes of Future Frontiers would be the last things that we've done, which I would commend to anyone. I guess one final thing is create your committees, get people talking. We have an EDI group at IFF. I guess most businesses do. It has a direct line to me and to the other shareholders, and it's got a remit to suggest ways that we can be more inclusive and to challenge us on the ways in which we may or may not be living up to that billing, to our ambitions, which probably is a good place to start, because again, coming onto places like this, talking, having the determination, as Jackie described, to make commitments and put yourself out there is a huge part of what we're doing.
Thank you so much, Jan. And again, thank you for being really frank. I think everyone's been very honest on this panel, which is really great, because that's what we need to do to move the conversation forward. So not really questions particularly in the chat, but more some interesting reflections. So someone reflecting on the sort of unsaid codes that are kind of endemic in working cultures and how problematic that can be, as well as interest in that from an employer's perspective, personal advancement even could be viewed as antagonistic to organizational development, and what that tension looks and feels like, and how that maybe plays out then when it comes to
yeah, I think it's great. I mean, it's not specifically that in and of itself it's antagonistic, but I guess it's as employers, as businesses, you're used to trying to control, right, to shape, to sort of make things happen at a time which works for you, and to sort of, this is the business plan, this is how we move things forward, right? And it's easy perhaps to not allow that to be challenged from elsewhere, and to sort of having other people take control of that can be seen as a threat to the business. And in reality, it's not. It's a great opportunity for the business, but it's very easy to get into a mindset. And I think a lot of businesses have been guilty of being in mindsets where they don't see it in that way.
Yeah, fascinated. I'm going to invite everyone to turn their cameras on. So we have 5 minutes left. So panelists, please rejoin with your cameras. And I just wondered, I'm just thinking about the best use of time. I mean, maybe if I just really quickly sort of give a little summary, and then maybe we can go around and discuss a bit. So it seems like transparency is key, accessibility, and making sure as well that it's not just accessibility, but being able to retain people, creating cultures that accept and enable people to stay. Actively recruiting in different environments. I like that from Sinead. I thought that was interesting and is a bit more radical than just, you know, taking off the requirement for a degree. So actually proactively going out, and it links also to what Jackie was saying about actually having to do something differently and having to change behavior. And I think Jan given lots of examples of how you're challenging yourself internally, really fascinating, interesting. Gosh, there's lots more, but I'm going to stop talking and I'm going to pass it over to each one of you, and maybe just, I don't know, maybe we could summarize from either reflections based on what you've been seeing in the chat and what you've heard from your other panelists on what you think the one thing you would sort of take away from this session would be. And maybe if we go Sinead first, because you're first in my eyesight.
Okay. This has been really interesting. I've obviously the speakers really interesting. The participants have been really engaged in this. And it's given me a lot of food for thought, and it's given me a lot of food for thought on how, as recruiters, we can enhance how we interview people, but also what we can do to also educate and inform our clients how they can improve their position. I think, Jan, the stuff that you're doing at IFF is brilliant. Other people are not doing it. Other people are signing up to stuff, but they're not doing it. So I think if we focus on deeds, I'm going to do what I can to spread the word that there are things that you can do that will make a difference. So I've loved it. Thank you.
Thank you, Sinead. Lee, can we go to you next?
Oh gosh, there's a couple of things. They're so unstructured as well, so you're going to have to forgive this like more. Again, I think what Jan is doing is brilliant, and I think that really points to the role of the SRA in trying to bring people together across the research ecosystem, because we all move between bits of the ecosystem. I've been in the public sector, private sector, in the third sector, and I'm about to move into an academic environment in January. So I think we need to come together and borrow from the best bits of each other, but there's very little opportunity to do that. It takes time and effort to bring people together, and I think the SRA should do that more. We're a very small team. Graham's hiding behind his switched off camera. He's probably going, no, but we need to sort of somehow use our resources, our very, very small resources well, to bring people together. We're only at the beginning of this, but it shows people are really, really engaged with this, and we can learn more. This is just the tip of the iceberg, or the white snowy middle class peaks. We've got to sort of talk about it more. No, I'm going to stop there actually.
Thank you, Lee. And Jan?
Yeah, brilliant session, really interesting listening to everyone. I guess one thing I take out from this particularly is that it can be easy sometimes to paint too negative a picture, right? And I think it's not necessarily negative. I think people in the industry that work in the social research industry certainly are, they tend to be very progressive, they tend to be very switched on, and we see from the group of people here who's talking, we've told our stories, right? And there is this kind of a hidden difference in our industry as well. So part of it is just, I hope what we do is giving that voice to come out, giving people the space and the voice and the courage to come out and talk. So yeah, I think one thing, main thing perhaps I take out is that sense that things aren't necessarily as bad as they may appear. And also just reiterate, I think that thing that, as an industry, we are a people-focused business. We rely on getting good people in, and like so many, Sinead will say, I'm sure that we are really struggling for people at the moment in the industry, right? The MRS has just started a piece to look at sort of the great recruitment difficulties that we've got, and the shortages of people power that we have throughout the sector. And so there's just a prima facie case, isn't there, for widening the sort of the trawl of who we try to bring into the sector, because that answers the fundamental problem that the sector has on being able to have enough people to deliver the great research and help organisations in the public and social sphere to improve themselves. So, it's a great coming together. It's a perfect storm situation. So, yeah, that's what I'd say in summary.
Thank you, Jan. And finally, Jackie. And sorry, we're on time, but you have the last word.
I'll try and be quick. I want to suggest to everybody that we need to see me, hear me, and be me. And I think the SRA is beautifully placed to elicit some of the stories that we've been hearing about today, also in the chat. I also want to challenge us to think about the best interventions. Okay, and there's been a lot of focus on, once you get into the professions, what you can do to support people through them. I think we need to be looking earlier down the pipeline, and that's where I would want to give my efforts and focus, because I think if we can get in earlier, we can find many of these amazing people who can come into the industry. And I would just finish by saying, I think experiential learning is the hidden message that we haven't touched on today, but we need more of. It's not about knowledge and skills, it's about experience of doing.
Amazing. Well, thank you everyone, that's been brilliant, and thank you to everyone who's engaged in the chat too. Really, really fascinating conversations. Bye.